Hi, my name is Earl Dumont, and I am very, very pleased that I am able to be with you today in video format, unfortunately. But I look forward to hearing what sort of projects you all come up with your monologue writing and your scene writing, and then eventually your competition play. So, congratulations for being part of this seminar, this workshop, and I've been asked to talk a little bit about some of the items that I have come across over my relatively short playwriting career, which is about 4 years old. There is a document that you can either have access to today or at a future time called Pitfalls for Playwrights. And in order to really get the most out of it, I think at some point there's some reflection that's going to be needed regarding the looking at some of these items. So, if you do have the document, great. We start with the introduction, and generally speaking, I am not a playwright by birth. It's something I started late in my life. I've always loved writing, and I've been fortunate enough to have a couple plays presented at Fringe Fest here in Virginia Beach, Virginia, and working with people like your teacher as well as other playwrights in the community level and beyond. So, despite not having been a playwright for terribly long, I have been a teacher for my entire career, including teaching of English and of writing. And in some ways, I find that the writing of plays is just kind of a realigning of the thought process of writing other kind of narratives, such as poetry or short stories or novels or any other format, graphic novels and the such. So, despite what type of writing I'm doing, I actually find that the writing process is only as good as the effect it has on a readership. So, what that means ultimately is if I am living in my bubble and I am writing in a journal or a diary or a spiral notebook or just typing alone in my room and I'm never really sharing it or getting some sort of feedback, then I am actually the only reader of it. And if that's the case, I always have this question of does that really, honestly, give you a better understanding of the world? Um, there's plenty of place and time for that idea of learning about yourself and learning about your wants and needs and so on. But once you cross that bridge into sharing your work, which by default, playwriting actually is about presentational writing. In other words, somebody's going to be seeing it, either reading it at a table read or in an English class, or possibly seeing it performed. So ultimately, you're crossing that bridge by becoming young playwrights. So that means that feedback is essential, and the relationship with your reader is absolutely essential. So be ready to rewrite, revise, and never accept draft one as your final product. So, in playwriting specifically, we have these things called characters, as you all know, and characters say things. So, we tend to think, especially if we are actors, that the words coming out of the mouth of the characters will actually be the storytelling aspect. And I'd like to submit to you this idea that they are not the storytelling aspect in the whole, rather, they are a fragment of the storytelling when you are considering a play. So, just for example, if you had 10 characters and they each are saying the same story but in their own versions, the true story, the true what happened, is going to be a combination of what character one said, 2, 3, 4, all the way down the line, if they're not lying and they're only giving their perspective. So the characters are only part of what makes up the narrative. In plays, you also have the set, you have the design elements, you have the props being used, you have the story structure, whether or not there's flashbacks being used, or if it speeds along in time, like 10 years later, that kind of thing, or if you have certain physical actions that take place. So all of this together, plus much more, all of this together makes up the meaning inside of a story, which means ultimately characters are not very accurate in telling what's really going on. It's accurate for the actor who's really learning about that character and so on, but not necessarily for the audience member. The next thing I'd like to point out, and this is me probably going against most of what I've been teaching as an English teacher, and that is the idea that plot is overrated. Plot is overrated. So what I mean by that is, in a short story, you have your traditional formats, which later we will take a look at. But the idea is that something is kind of explained with the setting, and then there's a rising action, and then conflict builds up until you get a climax, and then ultimately the epic battle takes place, and then there's the fallout from that, good or bad, and that's your story. So I don't actually like going into a theater and just simply seeing the story being told. I like to learn about the different characters and their actions and their reactions. There's so many subplots and sub messages happening that I would like to look at playwriting in particular as focusing on the theme or the message. The theme or the message as opposed to the plot. Things will happen, that's the plot, but theme and message is what the author is really trying to say about it. Finally, depending on how traditional you want to be or how experimental you want to be, style is an important aspect of that storytelling as well. So, unfortunately, I believe that in your English classes, perhaps, certainly my experience, plot is really sold as one of the main portions of storytelling, but I would like to say it's just a fraction of it, and some of these other things matter as well. So, if you really think about it, the plot being a portion of it means that you very well might not know the actual story when you start putting pen to paper. Hopefully you have a rough outline, a rough sketch of what you want to say, but ultimately not knowing how things are going to ultimately end up until you start writing, and it sounds kind of weird, but until the characters tell you their story. And that's a phrase I've been using for a long time. The characters will eventually tell me their story. So I'm typing away, I'm writing my first scene, and then something doesn't seem right, and then I think about it, and then I'm like, oh, you know what? She wouldn't really say that. I go back, I revise it, and eventually, what happens, honestly, about 15 drafts later, I'm like, okay, that seems to be that character's story. Same happens with a secondary character, a third character, and so on. So I usually discover what I'm trying to say very close to the end of the final draft. And if it feels like it's about what I want to say, that's when I kind of consider myself done with whatever I'm working on. And if you embrace that idea, what ultimately happens is you're going to get this character-driven play. And character-driven plays, in my experience again, are much more interesting from an audience perspective, and definitely much more interesting from an actor's perspective. So, to recap, do not abandon the idea of plot, but don't have it that you need to know exactly what's going to be happening. from start to finish when you start your playwriting. I'm going to move on to a portion of the paper that says, of my document that says, know the rules, be able to follow them, and only then break the rules. So that's going to be the next thing that we're going to be looking at.